Hello again, everybody, and this is part 2 of the video on the Great Depression and the New Deal. I want to remind you that your task is to play the role of your group, whether it be the New Deal for the jobless, the New Deal for the middle class, for business, or for the historically oppressed. Whatever group you're a member of, what you need to do is to analyze one alphabet agency that represents your group and explain whether the content of that alphabet agency represented a New Deal, the Old Deal, or that is something before the New Deal, or a raw deal for the group that you represent. Identify the facts that tell you so, not just from this show, but from the readings. The radical style of the New Deal should not blind you to the fact that the content of much of the New Deal was quite old and conservative. Now, there's a debate about that, so you don't have to agree. You can give me some examples of radical newness to the New Deal, and I hope you do, when you look at the alphabet agency that you choose to talk about. In the inauguration, there was a lot of radical rhetoric about the money changers and how Roosevelt was going to drive them from the temple of our civilization. He closed every bank in the country, and in a radio message he said, "My friends, it is safer to put your money in a reopened bank than to put it under your mattress." And the people had faith in Roosevelt, and they deposited money in the bank, the same banks they were running on and trying to withdraw money from in the days just before FDR became president. But when you look at the content of the bank bill, you see that it was passed by conservatives. That is, it was written by conservatives, including Hoover's old advisors who were kept on by Roosevelt. When you look at the CCC, for example, which was one of the 15 bills that was passed in the first 100 days, that flurry of action representing the bling-bling style, the content of the CCC was very conservative. The purpose of the CCC was to get young people out of the job market by sending them to the state or national forests where they would not be competing with adult labor. Now, that was great for adult labor, but it didn't do anything for the young people except give them 3 square meals a day and no job training that would be anything like the kind of jobs they would have to fill when they got out into the adult work world. So when you look at the content of these things, they don't look quite so new or perhaps so good after all. So when we look at the National Recovery Act, we have the same question. New Deal, Old Deal, or Raw Deal? Well, you have the relief section of the National Recovery Act, which created the PWA and the FERA. Do some research on those and decide whether that helped not just the young people, but helped the unemployed, helped the jobless, or did it help some other entities? That will help you determine whether it's a New Deal, Old Deal, or Raw Deal. What about Section 7A? What did it give for union workers? Look that up. I expect you to know that by the flipped classroom session. That represents one of these 3 possibilities, but which one? Recovery in the form of the Blue Eagle, the National Recovery Administration. Well, that also exemplifies the broker state. You could argue that the PWA and FERA were too conservative, that they didn't give enough aid to enough people. What's the argument for that or against that? The Blue Eagle, which was the name of the National Recovery Administration, which was supposed to bring about recovery for business, was also unconstitutional. And in 1935, the Supreme Court declared the whole thing unconstitutional. Well, what was the Blue Eagle anyway? Well, here it is. This is the sign that every businessman had to put in their window to show that they were cooperating under the National Recovery Administration. Here we have the Blue Eagle. Well, the Blue Eagle was administered by code authorities who were government officials who slapped a law on the prices, production schedules, and fair practice agreements of businessmen in the same industries who were forced to adhere to these agreements. Well, the problem with the Blue Eagle was that the code authorities were former big businessmen who made sure that the prices helped big businesses but not small businesses. And it was overly regulated. Too many businesses were overregulated. And the problem was that if a business violated the code, they would be fined by the National Recovery Administration. And that's what got it into trouble with the Supreme Court, because the power to tax is reserved to Congress, and the NRA was an executive branch agency, so it was declared unconstitutional in 1935. Now, if you look at the New Deal for Youth and look at the CCC and the NYA, the CCC only helped males, and only 2.5 million, which was a tiny slice of the jobless population. Many people wondered, where was the she? It respected prejudice, race prejudice, specifically segregation. It did nothing. There were all black camps and all white camps. It did nothing about segregation. The NYA, on the other hand, fought segregation. It helped twice as many young people as the CCC. It provided jobs for students in college and high school, and it trained young people to do the jobs they would do once they got out into the adult work world. And here you see Alan Kreider's painting of youth working in the New Deal. The Roosevelt reforms of 1935-36 were more radical. The Work Projects Administration, the Social Security Act, and the Wagner Act especially. But do these represent a new deal or the same old deal or raw deal? Frankly, it's more easy. It's easier to argue that these things represented a new deal, and you might wonder why. Well, you can research them and find out. But some people continue to find them to be a raw deal and quite conservative. What was conservative about the Social Security Act or the NYA or the Wagner Act? You've got to take a stand, and you've got to do it with facts. The New Deal's two sides are represented by Harry Hopkins and Harold Ickes, but you can read about them in your textbook. Hopkins represents the spending side of the New Deal, wanting to get money into people's hands as quickly as possible for the benefit of the jobless. And Ickes represents the conservative fiscal side of the New Deal, which wanted to make sure that every penny that was spent was accounted for, even if that meant lagging behind in the effort to help the jobless as quickly as possible. Roosevelt condemned the NRA decision, which was known as the Schechter decision, and he decided that the court would have to be enlarged by appointments of his own in order to guarantee a majority on the court that would endorse his New Deal. He wouldn't say that, though, before the election of 1936, which was his re-election. He got a landslide re-election victory, but when he took office for the second term in 1937, he launched his court-packing plan, a plan to enlarge the Supreme Court, and it was shot down by Congress. And once Congress resisted Roosevelt on the court, they found that they could resist him on other things. So you see very little New Deal measures, very few New Deal measures, I should say, in the second term. The Congress shot down any chance for an anti-lynching bill. So lynching even was not declared a federal crime because the South resisted that. Not that the South supported lynching necessarily, but what it was they did not like the federal government getting involved in Southern affairs. Roosevelt could do nothing to stop that. So there was a conservative Southern Republican alliance that basically caused the New Deal to stall in 1937. And after that, the only thing Roosevelt could get was rearmament in the years just before World War II. So you have a continuation of unemployment. The South became defiant. Roosevelt tried to endorse a liberal Democrat for the Senate seat in Georgia, held by Senator Walter George, but the Southern voters defeated his nominee and reelected George. And the last New Deal law was the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938 that set up the first minimum wage. Does that represent a New Deal, old deal, or a raw deal? So finally, the one-third of a nation that Roosevelt saw still suffering in 1937 remained unhelped by the New Deal. And you must choose an alphabet agency to analyze, and it's not necessarily the ones that you saw in the slideshow. You must find one of the alphabet agencies in the slideshow, but you can't talk about it if another student has talked about it. You must choose a different New Deal agency to talk about, and in that way, you will be able to say something original for the flipped classroom session. But you can use the agencies talked about in the slideshow if it hasn't been talked about by another student. So that's your assignment.